Goethe-Universität Frankfurt and Maine. He is the author of numerous books and articles on comparative constitutional law, legal philosophy and social justice, and his research are focused mostly on critical approach to human rights. Secondly, but not second, Professor Paulus Blokker, PhD from the European University Institute. He is a principal investigator in the research unit Constitutional Politics in Post-Westphalian Europe, POLIS, in the Department of Sociology, University of Trento, Italy. And his latest works are related to the crisis of the new democracies and constitutionalism and commons. So the last professor, but not least, who is coming, it's Professor Ugo Mattei, who you know. I will introduce him in any case. It's a professor in international comparative law at the University of California, Hastings College of Law in San Francisco, California, and professor civil law at the University of Turin. It's our coordinator, one of the coordinators of the International University College of Turin. So I leave the floor to Antonio, who is going to introduce you what the outputs of our morning session. And as you know, those are the guidelines for our discussion.
Yeah, basically this morning, as we discussed right now with our fellow students, we had a morning session talking about the commons, social movements, and human rights. And the point of this conference today would be trying to interact with you on the issues and questions that we gathered this morning. We now had a small session, closing session of 30 minutes where many questions raised. I don't know if I'll be able to wrap it up all of them, so I might ask you if you give the floor a few minutes after your speech to also let students make questions that I might forget, also because there were too many, so I tried to focus on few topics. So basically this morning we talked about firstly the commons, and we gave two case studies. One of the case study was about water management of a city, who was going to be privatized, and the other case study was about a building who had a theater and a school inside, who was going to be privatized as well. So we were supposed to answer some questions, specifically what kind of good are those goods for you, what kind of property arrangement do you see for them, what kind of values this property arrangement have to be part to, and what kind of governance do you see. Then about social movements and human rights, we had a different approach. We more had presentation because we had a lot to have students from all over the world, so they also share with us their experience. They lived in first persons. Specifically, we had presentations about the situation in Palestine, the situation of social movement in Turkey, Gezi Park, and also the situation of the Arab Springs in Egypt. And then Andrea introduced to us, if I don't forget anything, and then introduced to us some critical approach to human rights that we had the opportunity to study during the Carla, sorry. And Carla, I always forget this part. Carla gave a very interesting presentation of the constitutions in South America and the role of water is human rights in South American constitutions. So I tried to raise the main issues that came up this morning about that. Many issues were related to the commons as a property arrangement. For that, I think they would need to wait Professor Mattei for this specific aspect. While on the commons and social movements and human rights points that would be interesting to share with you would be, first of all, the commons as social movements have probably some problem of legitimacy, which is shared by also other social movements. So when we say the social movements actually try to change things in the direction of the commons, but also we saw that in the other experiences that we saw together, might have some problem of legitimacy in the sense they behave in the name of who. They might lack of legitimacy, but on the other hand they might lack of democracy, but they do act in the name of this principle somehow. Which raises also a different problem in terms of the dichotomy between legality and illegality. So what's legal and what's illegal, which again raises another problem of the dichotomy between constituent power and constituted power, right? I know that you focus on research, we all know that about the constituent power, social movements. So how does it relate also with the problem of democracy within the decision-making processes in these situations? Then always related to social movements, we also know the social movements often act in the name of human rights, Professor Frankenberg, and that human rights, in the experience of many countries that we shared this morning, we see that under a legal technical perspective might have some weaknesses. We saw, for example, in South America, the very fact that in Constitution water is described as a human right doesn't really change things, for example, in adjudication procedures. But on the other hand, it does change things under a political perspective because it kind of introduces a very powerful political discourse. So human rights can be a tool for social movements. But on the other hand, we also raise the problem of human rights as an hegemonic kind of also discourse that could be used for, let's say, implement some critical behavior and to justify them and to use a tool of legitimacy of behavior, which we didn't really see in a good way this morning. And in this sense, also we raise the question of who then defines human rights, and so how this powerful tool could be understood in this sense. I think that we could start with those topics, which raise already abroad many things, and then maybe we could have a little break and interrupt and maybe some questions. If you want to start, because we know you have a train, so since you have a train, you might as well get moving.
Okay. Well, there's an awful lot on the table, I would say. And there's an awful lot on the table that I am working on at the moment in terms of trying to put together a research project proposal which links particularly transnational social movements in the European context to constitutionalist and legal discourses. So perhaps some of this will come back in what I would want to say. But I want to start off with an element that I find important, and I think it also speaks to at least the sort of the first case study you addressed with the public building being put up for privatization because there's no money, etc., and the municipality has no other option. And so in a way, I think it makes sense to take a step back and think about what might be the critical dimensions to a discourse on the commons, apart from what is the overwhelming, I think, attention in scholarly and also public discussion that is the economic side, the property side, etc. But I think it might be useful to take a step back and think about what kind of critique does it provide of capitalism as such, and of what is still probably a misnomer, but what is still often seen as a neoliberal version of capitalism. And I'm also saying this because I recently published an article on this notion, but in that article I also explicitly relate some of these matters to the commons as a possible way of retrieving a form of critique which I call a political critique, which is extremely important, I think, for any kind of efficacy of alternative projects to the capitalist drive towards, let's say, the imperialization of the live world, the privatization of everything, including children, etc. And therefore, I think there's what I would call a political dimension to this thrust of a neoliberal capitalism, which dovetails, I feel, with some of the dimensions of the critique of the commons, let's put it like that. But I think it's also important to put this in perspective of more sociological discussions of what forms of critique have been powerful in the past. And I'm referring here to a set of arguments that is close to my interest and that are particularly formulated in a book called The New Spirit of Capitalism, written by Luc Boltanski and Eve Capello, and where they identify at least two types of critique that seem to be recurrent towards capitalism. And thinking about these forms of critique in the commons, it made me also think of how there's a dimension that is missing there, where it seems at least to be underplayed, and it seems to have been sort of dying out in a way, or becoming ever less visible since 1968, and that I think is interesting in its own right. And so, let's say the first key critique on capitalism, according to Boltanski and Capello, I think many people would historically at least agree, is the social critique. It is a critique of how capitalism exploits society, how capitalism imposes rules on society for its own benefit, so to speak. So key sources of indignation, as Boltanski and Capello call it, are indeed the impoverization of people, of originally the proletariat, but by now we're almost everybody is precarious, myself included. This might be ending soon, God knows. And secondly, an emphasis on inequalities. This in a way speaks to parts of the commons critique, I think, but this is not the whole story. And so here you have one type of critique that has been recurring, that has been coming back in different moments in time, and is also again, I guess, again today, extremely outspoken, for instance, in the Occupy movement. The difference between 1% of society having all the wealth and 99% being excluded, etc. But it doesn't, I think, show us how then to proceed to an alternative form of society. In a way, there is an absence of politics, I feel, in this type of critique. So that's one type of critique that's important, but that doesn't seem to help us thinking about how to formulate a comprehensive alternative to neoliberal capitalism. A second type of critique has been identified by these authors, particularly looking at 68, in the type of forms of critique that have been raised against capitalism that were seen as very different from the original social question as such. And so here you have to think about, well, let's say the transformations of lifestyles in capitalist society. This is close to indeed the repertoire of the Frankfurter Schule, talking about massification of society, capitalist control, people being alienated from authentic social life, social relations, etc. And the key indeed sources of indignation here are indeed forms of disenchantment, forms of alienation, the idea of inauthenticity of objects, of persons, etc. And so capitalism as a more sort of cultural source of oppression, indicating, I think, a dimension that is extremely important to the commons, and that is not merely exploitation, inequality, but actually impossibility of human freedom, of human autonomy. But a key problem here is also, I think, even if this equally, I think, speaks to the commons type of critique. So indeed, theaters being privatized away, the lack of, let's say, more critical forms of culture being presented to the public fits in a way a bit with this critique. But my main problem with this critique would be that it's highly individualistic, and it really focuses largely on individuals and their sort of liberation from this type of oppression. And so I think we should focus much more and think much more about the relation between the commons and politics, and think critically about how capitalism avoids politics, or hollows out politics, or depoliticizes spheres of society, and perhaps even depoliticizes politics as such. And so I think if there's one important dimension that we perhaps should be discussing more thinking about the commons, it's the political part. It's the democratic part. It's not the individual autonomy part, but the collective autonomy part. And here I think it might be analytically at least important to identify a form of political critique, a kind of concern with what I would call the pernicious influence of capitalism on political and social forms of collective self-determination. Because this might be our key problem of current times, that there's a lack of political imaginary that speaks to ideas of collective self-determination. And well, in the paper, this is a bit at the basis of what I've just been saying, but in the paper I try to identify two main issues here. That is indeed, on the one hand, a kind of depoliticization of the economy, the portrayal of the economy as living its own life, as being a sort of natural construct that we shouldn't be interfering with. The more we interfere with it, the less it will function. So a depoliticization, at the same time naturalization and essentialization of the economy. And with that, what is increasingly important discussion again, I think, the emergence of forms of technocracy, of neutrality, perhaps even of political technology, to use a term of Professor Frankenberg. And the second item is indeed the relation between capitalism and democracy as at the current moment mostly about a form of unbalanced coexistence, a kind of domination of economic modernity over political modernity, a kind of push towards the erosion of the collective, erosion of the political, erosion of the idea that politics is about sort of trying to discuss together what should be the main values and rules of living together. And so these two aspects, I think, are a sort of preliminary to any kind of more profound discussion of what the commons might mean in indeed all these real life situations of municipalities running out of money and trying in one way or the other to solve the situation. So these two dimensions, I think, need a lot of further reflection. Depoliticization first means that we pay much more attention to how capitalism is a historical, political project. It's not really an economic project. It's a politically constructed project with political justifications behind it. You might think here of the work of Albert Hirschman and his passions and interests argument. So we need to explore more, I think, how it is a politically constructed project to historically, contextually unearth the idea that there's no real alternative to a sort of competition growth-based idea of the economy, of which indeed forms of privatization are a very important part, I guess. So we should discuss the political imaginary, I think, behind current capitalist neoliberal relations as a pre-step to any possible form of identification of real-life forms of alternatives. And so the critique would say that the economy, and this is an old form of knowledge, but it has been sort of disappearing from circulation, I feel. An old form of knowledge that says that the economy, to put it sort of in Polanyian terms, is always already socially embedded. And we need to explore how it is socially embedded, and we need to explore how we can de-embed and embed it in different ways. We also need to acknowledge, and this is, I think, is much less discussed in many ways, in the sense that there's a hype in terms of Polanyian studies, but there's much less attention, I think, for the political dimensions of this. And so we also need to explore the political embeddedness of the market, or the deep political embeddedness of the market embedded in scientific, pseudo-rational knowledge, technocratic forms of governance rather than political, open, transparent discussions of what this economy is supposed to be about. So that's a key dimension, I think. And the second dimension is probably even more important for any kind of more comprehensive project, regarding indeed the erosion of collective autonomy. The consideration of collective autonomy as a kind of swear word, as something dirty, not to engage in, as if politics in this sense of the word is something extremely dangerous and affects indeed the natural working of society. That's extremely problematic, I think. So we need to rethink the relations between political and economic modernity, between autonomy and mastery, as, for instance, Cornelius Castoriadis called it. We need to rethink what are the possibilities of collective self-determination. And this also brings me to a much more, let's say, philosophically inspired point, and that is the need to move away from insistence on sort of rational knowledge, on forms of the absolute truth put into terms of, let's say, neoliberal economics, and the need for returning to a full-blown acknowledgement of the uncertainty of the human world, and sort of the acceptance of that there is no singular answer. And there also probably the commons discourse might be slightly more self-reflexive in some of its more normative takes. And well, this sort of reverberates with what Luc Boltanski calls a distinction between le monde et la réalité, the world and reality. The world being something we can never really comprehensively grasp. The reality being particular institutionalizations of the world, but always partial institutionalizations. So it seems to me that a forceful critique of neoliberal capitalism needs to bring this out up front. The whole sham of the notion of an end-all understanding of how capitalism is supposed to be working, how the market is supposed to be working. And so, well, that is one way, I think, of starting a discussion on the political dimension of the commons. The recuperation of what I would see as a kind of form of collective autonomy, which can then be, and this might be another discussion that wasn't, I think, explicitly put into questions, but can relate to, indeed, forms of institutionalization of the commons in more legalistic, in more juridical, but also in more political terms. But I better keep it.
Actually, this point of institutionalization was something that came up and I forgot, so you went straight to the point. So I don't know if we want to maybe open the discussion now with Professor Blokker. Maybe we can go on with Professor Frankenberg thing. And,
sorry. 4:40.
What time do you have to go?
It's 5:30, so
okay.
perhaps we better move on. Then we have
Yes,
more
yes,
today.
Okay.
Can I just answer it because it's not
Sure.
happening?
Yeah,
Sure.
Sarah will ask something.
So, like, yeah, the problem about institutionalization, just to put it forward, it was a problem. It was a problem that raised that we had in the sense that at some point we, very concretely speaking, we had the problem of saying, okay, we do an occupation, or we occupy a place, we do a protest, but somehow if we want to have a long-term project, we need something which can call nothing more than institutions, right? So the relationship between social movements and institutions, or the problem of the institutionalization of social movements, it looked to us kind of interesting, and it was something I wanted you to maybe deepen a little bit. I don't know whether now or after. If you want to maybe just give us an idea in a nutshell now, and then when Professor Frankenberg will finish the discussion, we can take it again.
Okay, no, well, this is a major conundrum, I would almost say, in the sense that I feel that some of the thrust we connect with bottom-up critique of existing institutions is exactly its sort of destructive force in a way, or its disruptive force, which you sometimes would catch in notions like civil disobedience, etc. And so, of course, when you start thinking about how to institutionalize this, you get immediately the problem of institutionalizing things. You will create new types of exclusion, you will create new types of inequalities. So one way of answering this in a more theoretical sense is trying to think about how incorporating possibilities for forms of civil disobedience in actual institutional structure, which seems to be, in a way, a contradiction in terms. But you might relate it also to a discussion about what somebody called the principle of anarchy, or what Claude Lefort has called savage democracy. And I think this is an extremely interesting challenge. In my own work on constitutionalism, which I've also been trying to relate to thinking about institutionalizing the commons, this is a major problem. How can you think of constitutions as, at the one hand, stipulating what we have in common, how we interact in common, what are so-called foundational values, but at the same time make sure that this is a never ending discussion and that there's always room for voice of marginalized actors, etc. The discussion there, as I think, is often is highly normative and so remains on the level of political reflections on constituent power of a largely theoretical, philosophical kind, or you see a large literature on, as you called it in your title, new forms of democracy, new sort of institutional vehicles for people to be excluded. I think there's a huge lack of interaction between these two literature. So that, I think it's a major item on the analytical agenda. Also because it seems to me that there's a huge resistance to thinking about how these types of more radical expressions of political engagement of citizens, how they might actually relate to a more durable form of inclusive type of politics. But I'm saying this also because I'm a bit involved in a sort of struggle in Trentino, since I work at the University of Trento, where citizens are trying to put more radical forms of direct democracy on the table of the province, and I've seen a huge resistance of political actors, seeing citizens as politically incapable, seeing citizens as not able to actually engage with all the intricacies that we associate indeed with economic knowledge, for instance, or with political, technological knowledge. And so that's, I think that's something to be scrutinized much more, and it fits a bit what I said before about an enormous need, I think, to rethink what politics means in relation to the economy, in relation to notions of the commons.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now,
Professor Frankenberg.
Great. So it's wonderful to be back and to see you all. And I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do. And I got several messages that I was supposed to give a talk, and then today that I was to give answers. So what I just thought, and maybe it sort of responds to your questions, that and this fits the age, that I may take a look back, because I feel that many of the themes that you have sort of brought up today, and sort of in a way they reverberate, and rather than giving you a talk that would be interesting or not, I just see what happens, okay?
Okay, sure.
So in 1989, coincidentally, with two colleagues, I was working on a book. We finished it in 1989. It's called The Democratic Question. So you can pick off the first of your three topics. Democracy, social movements. And it was about social movements, second, and it was about civil disobedience, third. You could say civil disobedience. Yeah, oh, thank you very much. It's out of print, and it's very expensive now. In eBay you can get it for 990,000, whatever. It's a stupid figure, but the publisher will not have a second edition. I don't know. So what I wanted to do, what was puzzling when we were doing it, that we felt we were entrenched between two camps. One camp I would call is the institutionalist camp. This is what Paul just said. So that people said, well, if you don't look at the institutions, you don't really have a sense of domination, and what you're doing is just romantic. And the other camp is the camp of the movement people. I mean, they say, well, you have to look at how you can preserve your spontaneous energies. So forget the institutional side. This is the dark side. You don't want to do this. It's depressing. It discourages people, and nothing will happen. And so what we try to do, and if any of you has ever done this with any other project, it's almost impossible to sort of to get through, somehow sort of pick up what you find crucial on both sides, and then combine it and sort of still find your own way. So that's what we actually, that was the project, and that's what we did, and it was successful for the three of us because we had a great time. We came to Italy, to Tuscany, and drank a lot of wine, and had to convince one another that this is really what we wanted to do. And what I sort of, afterwards, I pursued sort of several strands. The first strand was, see, I'm not an expert on the commons. I've done a little bit of reading for today, and I had done some reading before, but I think that's Ugo's topic, and I think we are just the warm-up guys here for the big thing. So, but what is interesting is that after the book, I thought, actually it stirred up a lot of discussion in Germany, which is more than you can say about most of your publications if you're in the publication business. Usually 7 people read an article that you have written or claim they have read it, and then 3 because they claim that you're friends, and so it's really, it's depressing, basically. I mean, one wonders whether, so it's so wonderful that he has the book. That was not planned. I mean, this is a surprise. So I pursued the topic of civil disobedience because I felt, I mean, I took it out of the context. The context, of course, was the rebellion in China and the dissident movements in Central and East Europe. And I thought maybe we can sort of work with it because I felt, and this is also something that relates to the comments, what is crucial in whatever you do and how much you consider the institutional setting of things, that you have to really somehow make sure that you somehow preserve the energies that are there, because without any energies, you have no change. I mean, or rather, you have the change, the social change that maybe people sort of do from their office or steer from their offices. So that was seemed to be one thing, and so I pursued it, and thus I pursued also social movements in Germany and other Central European countries. And then in the end, I wrote an article that some people thought was depressing. I thought I had to do this, and it's called, it's basically, it's about the ambivalence of social movements, because I really felt this, and that, well, if you remember my last show here, I'm really, this is my project now, that we really have to get beyond the romantic discourses and see that in some, that we have to be romantic in the sense of look for the good and hope for the best and be better than other, but that we really have to see that this is a highly ambivalent world, and there is nothing which is not ambivalent. So you really, I think if you really confront the ambivalence of things, whatever, whether it's common or whether it's parliamentary systems, whether it's social movements or civil disobedience, then you're really not you're avoiding the issue, I think. So, because I felt if you look at social movements, clearly if you look at it sort of from a romantic perspective, you can say, well, there's all the spontaneity and the creativity, and there is the multitude, and it's non-bureaucratic, it's so totally sexy, so you have, that's what you want to do. But if you see what happens with social movements once they are established, the picture changes and you get sort of shades of gray in there. And I didn't pick this, it's not sort of an allusion to this title, because you feel that, for instance, the European Union, they pick their social movements, and then they are accredited, and they have to sort of abide by certain rules. And of course, they are the fancy social movements. It's the same thing at the United Nations. They have access, of course, and so they have this reputation that they're really powerful. So somehow the established system, you could say, the institutions, they somehow manage to sort of drive a wedge in the sort of the colorful world of social movements. They co-opt some, and the other ones are left out, and then they have less influence, less money, and in the end, less people who support them. So that's the ambivalence in very brief terms about social movements. So that and you really have to address the issue of, for instance, of elitism. You have to address power is not something that is not there because you say we're good. The good people can be very powerful and establish power structures. So that's even that I think applies to the commons. I'm not saying that hasn't been done yet, but it has to be done. The analysis of the commons has to include the question who sort of has power, who is in power. Do we have a power structure in a movement that is basically, I would say, basically good and basically something that you want to support? Sort of addressing the ambivalence doesn't mean you become sort of less interested and less, but it's addressing the ambivalence makes it more viable. Second topic also is democracy, also pursued, also as a lawyer, democracy is not so important because you just teach election law and then division of separation of powers and all this bullshit. And it's sort of, and you think, this is what I have to do, and these are the routines. In a way, actually, they mirror the routines of our political life. But then for instance, when I read some of the articles about the commons, I thought, maybe I should go back to my original sort of analysis of the parliamentary system. Clearly, it's in crisis. I mean, I had prepared a little talk about that. But that's almost sort of trivial to say because the crisis theories about the parliamentary representative systems are age-old. But the question is, how could it be that in the early 90s in France, and these are in the mid-80s also, there are authors which I really still sort of hold in high esteem, like Marcel Gauchet, Claude Lefort. How could they possibly find something interesting and defensible about the parliamentary system when everyone says it doesn't work? I mean, it's just corrupt, and then big business runs the show. In the parliaments, they don't really discuss the crucial issues, and it's also behind back closed doors. Then, of course, now we know that it's even worse. We have the secret services running much of the show. So I think, how could they possibly not see that? And they are really intelligent people who had, I thought, very impressive theories. So I said, maybe one should look at the parliamentary system in crisis and see what is the crisis about. And so that's when I came to my few notes that I had tried to present you. I said, it's if you look at political science, they are supposed to tell you what the crisis is about because that's their business. I mean, as lawyers, we don't have to look at it. We just do law. I mean, this is not the parliamentary system. What I found interesting in political science, if you sort of read through the current literature, you have one discourse which is highly pessimistic. It's post-democracy, post-politics, everything is over, and people are not participating in politics. The party constituencies are melting down. There are no political milieus anymore. So everyone is sort of more hedonistic. So it's terrible actually. So that's a bit oversimplified the pictures that they present. They have wonderful books there, like Post Democracy by Colin Crouch is a very fascinating book to read. I mean, it's unbelievable. But then there are others which I don't find that fascinating. They come from Carl Schmitt, and Carl Schmitt has always sort of tried to trash parliamentarism. So that's a reason to turn around and defend parliamentarism, I think. And that's my basic reason. So then you have another group, and they say, no, it's all wrong. You've got it all wrong. I mean, democracy is vibrant right now, and if you look at what's happening, like as you said, it's in Gezi Park, and you have social movements, and you have what in Germany they call citizens in rage. I mean, they oppose projects of infrastructure. So it's even older people demonstrate. I mean, in '68, when you were 25, you were not supposed to demonstrate anymore because you were too old. And now demonstrations are sort of carried by people over 45. That is really not depressing, but that's an interesting item. And so if you look more closely, you feel maybe there is something between those two blocks of theoretical interpretations. Maybe it's not the idea to be pessimistic, and it's not the idea to be optimistic, but maybe just sort of see the ambivalence of democracy today. And I would say the ambivalence, you could also be nice and say this is a more realistic approach, but that has a normative underpinning that I would like to avoid. So how do you get there? And I said to myself, maybe if we can sort of have a differentiated approach and ask who is not participating today in, I'm talking about the democracies that I sort of can cover, I mean, cognitively. So it's interesting to see that, yes, the optimists are right. There are these people who all of a sudden are really actively engaged in politics, in social movements. And I mean, like the old 68ers, and they are older people, like me, and some are younger, and some are even older, and so, but somebody is not there, because the pessimists are also right that the parliamentary system sort of is losing a lot of support in the population. And then you see there is if you look at democracy as a form of governing or government, then you see that sort of there's also a cleavage that sort of the educated middle class people, they are not participating. They're not passive at all. They're very active. They vote, and they are also in the social movements. They're actually they even, some of them they're even in sort of in organizing political parties. So that's not the problem. The problem group is what some people have called the underclass, the political underclass. They are not sort of participating in social movements. They're not participating in elections. They're not participating in political parties. Why not? Because we are offering new forms of participation, like we have mediation procedures to discuss infrastructure projects. Because all these new forms of participation, at least as far as I can tell in Germany and the neighboring countries, they presuppose qualifications that you don't have if you're a member of the underclass. You need to be able to argue, for instance. That's a crucial thing. Like you better be educated. Somebody said you need to be a counter-expert to confront the domination of the experts. And this is, I would say, that is the problem. I would say the problem is not the parliamentary system, and that's where I disagree with what I read about the comments. The problem is, you could say, the domination of experts. They are running the show in the parliaments and outside of the parliaments, and they're also running part of the show in the social movements, because I really like this term, the metaphysics of expertise. If you are confronted with expertise about should we build this dam, should we have this, how you call these windmills, whatever, these wind things, right? The cruise, whatever. Yeah. Yeah. Should we do this? You have to have a lot of sort of technical knowledge to confront the experts who say yes we do or no we don't. So that's what I mean. I think that is by dismissing the parliamentary representative system completely, we are losing the sense of where it's ambivalent and maybe where the real enemies are. And even the real enemies, the the experts who are very influential, you have to admit that yes, we need a lot of expertise to run government. We cannot run government like we could run a local little community. It's impossible. I mean, we need institutional structures and we need a lot of expertise. But the question is, how is the expertise and how are the experts held responsible? How are they controlled? How are they selected? So then you get into this nasty business that you need a certain kind of input. You cannot say we do it spontaneously or we just produce the expertise on our own, but you have to somehow bring in people and then you want to make sure that you keep them under control. And I think that is the problem, that democracy as a sort of as a form of governing sort of has the problem there, and that I would say the term is that it's the domination of experts and expertise who are not controlled. And then another aspect that may not sort of relate to what you have said, and I will just bring it up and then leave it there, is that democracy, and maybe that's why it's so unattractive, has lost a lot, not as a form of governing, but as a form of life. And as a form of life, you would say it has two aspects. One aspect is Hannah Arendt would say, the agonal. There's this competition, conflict. I've always been obsessed with conflict because I mean, in your own life, you all know this, and there's always conflict, so you have to deal with it. And that democracy as an agonal event means that the crucial conflicts of a society have to be represented in the parliaments, whether it's on the federal level or the state level or the regional level, doesn't make any difference. And everyone has to have access physically, but also cognitively. You have to really understand what's going on, but I come to that and then I'm done. So I think that's not happening right now, especially not if you have governments who follow the Margaret Thatcher slogan of Tina, there is no alternative. If you're confronted with the idea there is no alternative to this, for the average person it's really difficult to really oppose something because they feel, yeah, maybe they're right. Maybe we have to have nuclear energy. And if you look at all the projects only in Germany that were sold in the beginning as there is no alternative to that, it's very telling. Like this monorail was said to be, we need to have this in Germany. And then, of course, we didn't need. Then we had these special type of nuclear reactor, which the experts said, we have to have this. And of course, the government says so. And then turns out now it's a park where kids can play because they built all these things, and then it didn't work. So there are lots of airports that nobody wants and nobody needs. So I mean, all these huge projects which cost millions and were just wasted, and of course the only sort of groups that profited were parts of the economy. But this TINA thing, this shows that I would say the political class is lacking sort of the imagination to come up with different projects. Like Frau Merkel said, we have no alternative to the crisis management in Europe that we are sort of initiating right now. And then you can really see that all of this means that democracy as an agonal event is really in big trouble. And the other side is, and then that's my last two sentences, is the democracy as a theater of emotions. I mean, liberalism has always had problems with emotions, and so liberal democracy was always nervous about emotions and was talking about choice, agency, and all these things. And you read about this in the articles, also on the comments. But it means that if you exclude the emotions, you make democracy a really unemotional, but also uninteresting and unengaging project. And theater also means that you have to translate what you discuss, the big problems translated into a language and into the horizon that people can really understand what's going on. And this is not happening. And that's why social movements are so attractive, because they sort of can localize the problem and they can translate it and sort of bring it home to people. And this is not happening in parliaments. Nothing is happening there, if you ask me. So that's what I would argue for, is that, so on all levels, I leave out the human rights because we talked about human rights when I was here the last time. So when you talk about social movements or democracy, that sort of, or the commons, your position is strong if you can sort of look at the ambivalence of each. So you don't dismiss institutions, you don't dismiss movements, but you try to figure out how can you have both, even if you think they're really bad partners in the same marriage.
Thank you very much. And I think that now we can open the floor to questions. We had, as I told you before, we had a 30-minute collecting questions just before you arrived. So I think it would be the right moment where you guys could directly ask your questions to our panel. Specifically, there were some topics that we discussed and that, of course, they did not have the time to cover. So if there are some specific topics that you're interested in that came up before, this is your moment. Maybe also about human rights or the legitimacy problem, and so forth.
Few, but I really need to go to the toilet. So may I be the last?
Okay, not to tell you the questions afterwards.
Take the ride.
Well, that looks really serious.
That is a fundamental right, anyways.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question about the issue of human rights.
Excuse me, repeat because it's...
I wanted to ask a question on the issue of human rights. So if we assume a critical approach to human rights and we say that they can be used as ideology or the thing uses a means, and so they lost somehow part of their value, and we reject human rights as ideology or myth. I was wondering which is the alternative, and why should we, in a sense, fight against human rights and not just try to use human rights as every other legal tool we have, so without questioning if they're actually now they are used in a wrong way. Why don't we just start using them again, in a good way, in the way they can be used to be useful for people?
May I answer?
You prefer to collect questions
Okay,
before
sure.
answer? No, I was asking, the way you prefer.
Whatever. If there are other human rights, maybe we should have a human rights block, and that
There is other questions.
other human rights.
There were many before, so just...
Have a go, Gunter. Have a go.
Have a go. So, when I gave the talk the other day, way back, I did not mean to discourage you from using human rights. I just wanted you to realize that there is an ongoing romantic human rights discourse, which overlooks that human rights have a mythical element, an ideological element, and that human rights also normalize in a very problematic way. To realize that, and I think, I really think that the argument can be sustained that this is true, empirically true. So I'm not, the answer is, or the consequence is not, let's drop human rights and do something else. No, but you can still do human rights, and in sort of today's terms, I would say, just see the ambivalence of what you're doing. Or if you don't even want to, if you oppose something, you don't want to realize, what was the myth again? What did he say? No. Just take the simple sort of, the gist of all of this is that human rights offer you a vocabulary. And if you feel it sort of helps you to sort of energize people, solve a problem, whatever, then do it, go for it. But what I'm wary about is that it's human rights discourse is sort of, you just sort of tap into the discourse. It's a little bit like a drug addiction because you really feel good, oh, it's human rights. But you don't really, and everyone thinks that those people who are for human rights are against the bad things in the world. That, I think, is too simple. And you should not let yourself get away with that. So, but if you feel this is the problem, so what would be good strategies? You could say, well, maybe I use a human rights approach because I can mobilize more people. It could also be that you use the vocabulary of the economy. Sometimes it's good to tell people that this is not efficient or whatever, or it costs too much, right? And I want to get this glamour of human rights, which is justified, I would say, by nothing. And the risk is so high that you're losing other vocabularies that are competing with it. If you see human rights vocabulary competing with others, a more political, a more economical vocabulary, then that's fine. Then you should do that. Is the answer okay?
Yeah.
But no, don't drop it. I mean, we all should have as many rights as possible. And I'm serious. I mean, it sounds ironic, but it's only half ironic. I mean, why would you say no? He doesn't have a right to speak. He doesn't have. I fought a big case for the right to demonstrate in airports, and I'm really proud that, because we felt that was crucial that we used the legal human rights terminology to get to sort of make this terminal hall a public forum, and that you cannot do that with psychology or whatever. You needed human rights.
Could I say something to that as well? Well, I tend to agree wholeheartedly with this. I think on the one hand, a good way of looking at human rights is seeing them as ambivalent indeed. So on the one hand, they codify something, they make something in a way semi-permanent, and in that sense they might also be imposed on people in a way. On the other hand, I think it's equally true. You just need to think of examples like the civil rights movement, or think of Carta 77 in 1970s in Czechoslovakia, etc. They can be used as potentially emancipatory instruments. But what makes me more ambivalent today is what I see is an ever more diffused attempt to substitute democracy for human rights. So it seems to me that there are increasingly discourses saying democracy doesn't work. Democracy is anyhow, when it did work in the past, it's a national phenomenon. It's linked to a territory, to a people, etc. Nowadays we don't have that anymore. Borders are roughly meaningless. Societies are increasingly pluralistic. Democracy cannot really speak to that. So we replace that with human rights that are then protected by all kinds of courts, the European Court of Justice, European Court of Human Rights, UN, etc. And so then we make sure that all those good things are actually being protected. But the enormous danger there, I think, is that people lose sight of the fact that human rights, just like technocratic reason, is a kind of conversation stop. It says this is the way things are, not like this. So it in a way depoliticizes as well, I think. And that can be an extremely dangerous element to human rights, particularly when they become, as I think they are in many cases, hijacked, I would call it, by indeed institutions that are not democratically accessible. So if the European Court of Justice argues, as it has done in many cases, that the right to free movement is more important than social rights, or the right to private property is more important than the right to free speech or so. You see that these are important, highly important decisions made by an institution that is not really political. And so you get key questions being decided by actors that are not really democratically operating. And so you risk reducing the space for politics and heightening, increasing a space of some kind of rights governance or whatever you want to call it. So that I think is a really dangerous phenomenon in many ways. And I see even, it's a bit like Ionescu's theater play on the rhinoceros. I see people around me that used to be active democratic activists slowly changing into rights defenders and sort of losing sight of politics as agonistic. Politics as saying there are some issues that it can't reduce to end all sort of concepts. That always need to be open to discussion. And I sometimes feel the rights language is really trying to sometimes move away from that, to create certainty where there really isn't any certainty to matters. And that might be equally true indeed for many of the rights discussions around the commons, the right to water, the right to internet, the right to perhaps even to work and things like that. So we need, I think, to at least critically engage with that. What does that mean? How is this still inclusive, particularly of those groups that are not necessarily able to defend rights in front of courts through litigation, etc.
No, you were first actually.
So thanks a lot for the presentation. Very fascinating. So just one question each, which are more clarification. So I really understand what you're saying, and I totally agree with you in your first presentation. I was just wondering, when you use the word like the subject we need to repoliticize, we need to look historically, we need to do that. Who are you referring to? So who are these we? Because if you talk about academia, I can probably agree with you. But if you talk about social movements that need to repoliticize their struggles, with the little experience that I have in Italy with occupations and stuff, people know 100% that that's a political struggle and they're conducting a political campaign. And the problems is everything else. So they can conduct a political campaign, they can be political, but then they face institution, and then they need to transform their claims into something that is acceptable by the institution. So that's the problem. So they are political in every moment of their life. When they're quite building, they are political, they know that. They know that it's a problem of capitalism, they know it's a problem of history, background, inequality, etc. But then it comes the moment where you interact with the institution, with the state, with law, and that's problem. That's when the problem arises. So if you say that the academics are not recognizing that, and they're not really interacting with people occupying and with the social movements, I totally agree with you. So probably I think you should specify a little bit more who this we are, probably opening spaces like this one to people who are politically engaged and politically active. And going to Mr. Gunter's presentation, I really am fascinated by these ambivalences and looking at the gray areas of institutions, of social movements. And what you were saying about the experts capturing social movements, or the fact that social movements are somehow entering into this loophole of experts and presenting their arguments through experts. I must say that I'm working with NGOs and actually do the expert in this situation, so I totally agree with you. But I was wondering whether that's an inherent problem of social movements, or that's the problem, again, of they are talking with someone who does not recognize their legitimacy if they do not use the vocabulary, the words, the language, the instruments of experts. So, because I think that, again, if we look at our occupation here in Italy, or if we look at movements, social movements against Melo Monte Dam, or anti-land grabbing movements in Africa where peasants are struggling, fighting, throwing stones, occupying, they don't need expert. They are not expertizing the struggle and their movement. But then, if they want to be heard by parliaments, by the international community, etc., they have to shape their arguments through the vocabulary of human rights, etc. So again, the problem is not the social movement, the problem is the people actually looking at the social movement, interacting with them, but not recognizing them. So again, so is it a problem of the social movement, or is it a problem of us looking at social movements and we want them to act in the way that we are more familiar with? So we are lawyers, we use certain vocabulary, and so that this one makes me questions.
Thank you for your questions. Really defined. So, there's some others, or do you want to reply immediately?
Let's reply immediately.
Okay.
Well, the we question is an interesting one, I think. And I ultimately wasn't only thinking about academics. And I wonder to what extent one shouldn't also include at least certain exponents of social movements. I mean, it seems to me that at least part of the romantic spontaneity that was mentioned before is sometimes also translated into forms of, well, at least the pretension to have access to the absolute truth. And that might be necessary to provide the sufficient energy to actually do these types of struggles that are extremely difficult. But I think it's part of the struggle should be at least the diffusion of the message that the debate should be kept open. And this also means, and I think, a way of enhancing, mobilizing potential, because it's nice to sit in Teatro Valle and do your stuff. But how many Italians are actually aware of this? Very, very few. So in that sense, the democratic mobilizing dimension might need some kind of, and by the way, I'm not particularly criticizing Teatro Valle or anything. I'm just saying that sometimes, for instance, discussion in the Commons might need some more pluralistic sort of tolerance of different types of discourses, so to speak. So in that sense, I do think it sometimes plays back to social reality in itself, because it seems to me, and this is an abstract discourse, I agree, but I think it's absolutely necessary. I think this plays also into the idea that we need to start understanding institutions not as eternal structures or anything, and particularly from the point of view that different types of knowledge need to be represented and need to find their place in these institutions. So if we start playing the institutional game of the existing institutions, it's very easy to get co-opted in the same old story again. And so then ultimately the big struggle seems to me might be lost. You see what I mean?
Two great comments. When you said who's we, I wanted to say we the people, but of course, because I always thought, yeah, I want to be part of the people. And then you look at the people and no, I don't know. That people I don't want to be part of. And which brings me back to the second, I mean, when Paul said it and when I use it here, the we, I think you're right. We have to be really very, very careful when we address a collective that sort of includes us, but not really. So that was it's a good point. But here I would say we is just the people who are here in this room and who sort of struggle over the problem of the commons and civil disobedience and civil society and whatever. I mean, that was the sort of the audience. We is the audience. We the audience. So that would be my answer there. And then ambivalence. It sounds maybe like a slogan, but I really mean exploring the ambivalence. Like if you take your private relationships, like if you sort of, we all are romantic about our whatever princess or prince we have found, but the romantic discourse, the romantic vision doesn't get you very far, because at one point when you do the dishes, and I don't want to go into details, you don't feel romantic anymore. But if you address the ambivalence of personal relations and then social relations, then you realize, well, is that the ambivalence that I can tolerate? So it's a much more, I would say, a more mature and less neurotic approach to relations in general. And also, I felt that if I look, for instance, around in political science, which used to be my field, but I really, when I read all these texts, I'm glad that I'm also in law, because lawyers may be dumb, but at least they're, so you know what they are talking about. They don't, of course. But if you look, you sometimes think, and that is something that relates to what Paul said before, you really want to go nuts, because here there are people who say democracy doesn't work. It's too national. And there you see people who dream of cosmopolitan democracy, and they are totally convinced that this is we have to be moving there. And they don't have a sense of the local, they don't have a sense of the national, they don't have a sense of crisis. They just say we have to, if you really believe in the good, and that's what I mean by romantic, that someone gets me there. Maybe, but I have never experienced that, and maybe that's why it's for me it was a very difficult learning process, because to confront ambivalence is really a tough thing, because it somehow takes some of the energy away that you get with the romantic approach, but it lasts longer, let me tell you.
You had a question, right?
So, yeah, so it's very much related to this, so maybe I'll continue this instead of asking the question. It's right, we can always take this to the second order, right? We can say, are you ambivalent about ambivalence? Are you single-minded about ambivalence? It seems to be this really interesting, I think, what I understood Tommaso to be asking. There seems to be a very interesting relationship between the type of fire and single-mindedness and mental propensity to think of reality in rarefied terms, to think that I am right, in the legal sense and in the philosophical sense. And this is happening both in the coalition and in the opposition, right? So the discourse of counter-expertise, or a Marxist notion of value, and they are exploiting me and I am objectively exploited, and this is taking from me something that is mine. Actually not so far from neoliberalism in many of its underpinnings. And I guess my personal frustration with this is that at some level, philosophically, I'm very disappointed with this. I think it's almost always bad in the type of resistance that it produces, but there is something about the light or the fire that comes with this notion that seems absolutely indispensable to not even to political action, even to our own personal psychology. So maybe that's also an ambivalence about the lack of ambivalence.
Well, this is a tough one. I'm having trouble with the first order. How could I possibly move to the second? But let me give you an example. So when I tried to be an active student and join the movements, I was struck by the deeply authoritarian structure and competition, because they all claimed they were right. They had, of course, the right. It was almost like a biblical experience. They had the right thing, and then later I realized it had to do with most of it had to do with the psychology of the people, but some had to do with the idea of critique of ideology and false consciousness. I mean, how can you possibly say that you have a false consciousness, and by implication, my own is right? I mean, this is ridiculous. And so I was very happy reading later, coming back to this, reading people like Eagleton or others who can sort of do a critique of ideology without implying that you are on the second level, and you can sort of from this meta level you can judge the other one, and that's one. And the other reaction is, I don't think that you lose any energy by confronting things, phenomena, institutions, movements as well. They're ambivalent. Doesn't mean that you're an outsider. You can be totally with the movement. You can be totally for the comments. For instance, I will rearrange my legal philosophy lecture in the fall and then bring in, because I think that the idea of the commons is fabulous. But you still can see, well, there is something that we have to work on. It's not. I don't think it's ambivalence is discouraging at all. If you're ambivalent, I think the only persons in the world I'm not ambivalent about is my kids, but that has a reason. But the rest, I can handle the ambivalence and have good relations with adults. But I would say the kids, that's a different story, and I want to leave this out. But in politics, why not? I mean, why not say, yeah, parliamentary systems, they have terrible problems, and then we have to make sure that they are not run by politicians or by experts or by actually by the economic elite.
Let's take for a moment. Sorry for interrupting, but
it's okay.
Let's take for a moment the case of global income inequalities. So when we say some people in Africa live on less, or in the global south live on less than $3 a day. Okay? Shocking statement. We all think of what we can buy with $3 a day, and we think that this is a radical case of.
I'm really sorry, but I
Yeah.
have to be non-ambivalent.
Okay.
to run.
Thank you very much for your lecture.
Thank you guys. And,
Bye.
excellent discussion. I'm sure Ugo will substitute me now. Cheers.
Interchange.
Cheers, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
So, shocking statement produces a huge political effect, right? We could start asking, what is purchasing power parity, and what does it mean that I live in $3, and how can the concept of value in the north and in the south could ever be commensurable, and are we actually giving ascendancy to measuring things in dollar terms that are simply inappropriate? And the political statement is completely deflated. It's gone, right? So the tension here, it seems like a type of ambivalence that is much more difficult to manage than I am within my group, I am within my relationship, and I say what is wrong within the relationship because I think that would increase its chances of surviving. So,
Of course. But still, I would say it's not an answer. It's just a reaction. Why the disparity in Africa? Why not start with disparities that you can more immediately influence? So that's what I learned from the so-called student revolution, that they really work with what I would call borrowed realities, rather than focusing on what's going on, let's say in Germany or in England or in the US. Some did. It had to be Vietnam. And it had to be, and if you talk to people, few people really knew what was going on. I had sort of taken the time to see the type of warfare, and I thought it was appalling. But most people just thought, no, I mean, Ho Chi Minh sounded great. So that's what I mean. I mean, and that's what I find so fascinating about the idea of the commons. It seems to be tailored to what we can do, rather than to what we can think about. Yeah, you can write about and think about, speculate about, and write demands about disparity in Africa. But I think there is something that we can and have to do right now. I mean, and I'm sure Ugo will tell us. And that's another, I would say it's another genre that we should pursue more intensely, because that's where we are. And I still can say, okay, I will try not to buy T-shirts from Henderson Mowats. That's what I can do. It will not probably make a dent in the chain of production structure, but that I can do. But I can do more, I think, in terms of, let's say, turning an occupied building into some institution that is open to the local public.
I think we can have another question. Then I think we all deserve a little break before the arrival of Professor Mattei. Do you have a question?
I have only one that is related with your last answer. So
Sure.
You answer it perfectly well with my question. I will start a question opening with an observation. Before you get in, everyone here in this room presents itself with a field of interest about commons. And the first thing I've noticed as an outsider is the deeper split between person who came from a different historical experience. For example, here, you are from Belarus, right? I got some friend from Moldavia and Ukraine, and it's strange how in the same age, different situation, they consider common bad because they live in a universe of language, the socialist, URSS, who consider it the most valuable, the most important good ever, the commons, and what produce in their lives. Produce some disequality. So they refuse that, refusing and avoid to consider we as son of advanced capitalists, as the political science you talking about before, their kind of analysis, the analysis on the prices, and we as son of this kind of economic system, we achieve the idea of commons, I think, as a reaction to what we can do in this system right now, commons. But the problem is, what's commons? I don't think that the building is a commons, maybe the garden, but it's a very, it's a sort of interpretation. You try to pool your word, your commons to
encompass.
Yeah, to get in what you consider unjustified ruined for you. You see that building, this building was an historical building, was part of the community, so you decide it's a common. That is not true. Water is a common. Common is what we share, and what we decide is common. If we decide that the Pisa Tower is a common, it's because its historical heritage is a common. But in itself, it's only a building. We choose it as a common because it is a symbol, it represents something. As the Cavallerizza. Cavallerizza is a common because it is a symbol of something, of Turin, of public choice. But the problem is, what kind of weapon as social movements we have? Expertise, but you tell that expertise, we'd have a lack of counter-experts because we need to share a bridge of communication from institution to social movement. But the problem is, every kind of social movement are progressive? Question mark. I don't think so. There is here in Europe, in North America, or in Turkey.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but like, if you could have come up to the question so that we could
sorry, I'm lost
maybe
myself in this. Sorry.
So just the question is.
The question is, you think we need more participation in the social movements, contemporary social movement, as active citizen, or we need to be more experts? So, got maybe smaller social movement, not Occupy Wall Street, not in every city of US try to scream for change, but got more focused and more concentrated about what we can do. What is better for you? A large, huge mass, a large social instance as Occupy Wall Street, or something less big and more focused, like we want the Cavallerizza free and public, and we are 100%, 200%, and not more.
So like basically, try to summarize the question is, what gives strength to a social movement? What kind of elements do you think would give strength to a social movement?
The expertise, or the,
Yeah, I think it's
Yeah.
clear.
This is one of the questions that you can't really answer because it is too broad and too specific at the same time. So I would say, if I catch your drift, I would say, there are some social movements that I wish wouldn't exist because I completely disagree with their politics. Like there are groups that qualify as social movements from a sociological point of view, unless I sort of say I have a normative register for social movement, and that's ridiculous. They are too, for instance, the neo-Nazis in Germany. I wish they wouldn't, the so-called free comrades, I wish they wouldn't exist. So, and I really don't even want to think whether they should be bigger or small. They should be so small that they should be non-existent. There are other social movements that I feel they are really sort of concerned, they're really self-critical, they should be as big as possible. But if we leave this aside, then we have to see that a social movement can seriously only be called a movement unless we give up all distinctions. As long as it doesn't have this institutionalized structure. I mean, if I have an institutionalized structure, I should be honest and say this is not a social movement. The Nazis, Hitler, Mussolini, that wasn't a social movement, that was a sort of institutionalized regime of fascism. You can have, it doesn't have to be fascist, but so I would say for a movement to be a movement, it has to sort of find a balance between sort of spontaneity and institutionalizations. And that answer, that I can just leave sort of, each of you can look into your countries, and that's the wonderful thing about this group, that you come from all over the world. So, and then you see, well, we have this group and they're actually a pseudo party, and this is a social movement, this is a group that I really think is neither. So that's what I feel, this is the best I can say to your comment and question.
Sorry for the long.
No, it's okay.
I think we can have a break, like a 20 minutes break before coming back, so we can come back at 6. Hopefully Professor Mattei will be here so we can continue the discussion.
Yeah.
And
If not, I will pretend to be Ugo.
You really want to do that?
are you sure you really wish to?
Yeah.
I think.
Really rusty. Some months. Sorry.
So they told me you were in my city.